And I'd like to invite Angela Dean to the stage, and Angela is presenting Scrutinising Strategies to Create Social Change, Modelling the Impact of Different Policy Instruments on the Adoption of Agricultural Practices. Thanks, Ange.
Thank you. It takes 6 minutes to say the title. I'm inspired from Peter's talk this morning, not just to engage more meaningfully and collaborate with traditional owners, but also to take off my shoes more often to present. So thank you. Even though those shoes haven't been worn for 2 years. But anyway, I'm going to use my timer so I don't need to have Umberto, but feel free, Umberto, if you need to. So this project is one of the ones that some of you will be familiar with, a suite of projects funded by Department of Environment and Science and Office of the Great Barrier Reef. And this particular project is about trying to figure out how effective our policy instruments are at achieving change. The focus is on water quality and nutrient inputs, basically from agricultural practices. And we know that a lot of things get used. There's agricultural extension projects, there's a bunch of regulations, there's economic instruments like grants and other incentives, there's governance and collaborative approaches, and there's more recently some community-based social marketing that's starting to get interest. But what are they actually doing? Are they actually changing farmer behaviour, changing practices and changing water quality? One of the things that's really hard to assess this using traditional empirical methods, partly because a lot of these get turned on and off at different times. So at any one time you'll have quite a mix of instruments. So to address this particular question, we used an expert elicitation Bayesian network modelling. I am not the modeller, so if we've got, some of them might be online today. Yeah. So what we did was created a series of Bayesian networks. We brought a team together. So the basic way this sets up is that we've got nodes that reflect the policy instruments, which are all in blue. We've got a bunch of mechanisms, which are in grey. We've got a bunch of practice characteristics, which are in orange, and we've got a bunch of farmer characteristics, which are in green. So together we set up this complex model. This is not the basic model. And then what you can do is you can parameterize it and set things to particular settings. So we parameterize the impact of whether a practice is difficult or whether a farmer agrees with the issue, and then tweak the interventions to see what the impact is on adoption. So the model design, this was a structured expert elicitation. It was an incredibly intensive process where we had economists, we had lawyers and legal and regulatory experts, we had modelers, we had extension experts, we had psych behaviour change people, we had a bunch of other people as well. And a lot of it was developing that shared language took time, as we learnt this morning. So a lot of the first months were people saying, what does that word mean? What are you talking about? I learnt that it took 3 months for me to realise that the word behaviour change meant something different to everyone else in the room than what I thought. So there was about 100 hours of facilitated discussion with both the internal core research group as well as the stakeholders. This was based on research where data was available, but on expert opinion where specific data was not available. So the basic structure of the model is we were interested in adoption of agricultural practices. We had 5 key types of instruments, so extension, financial, regulatory, governance, and community-based social marketing, which we've called communications for shorthand. We've got a bunch of mechanisms by which we think these create change, and we've got both practice characteristics and farmer or population characteristics. So this is the actual model. You can fiddle with it, and it's incredibly addictive if you're into that sort of thing. So this part of the model is the extension. There are 7 particular types of extension characteristics, for example, that you can adjust in the model. This section is the financial instruments. I've forgotten to add the timer, so if someone can tell me when to stop, that would be great. This is the communication for behaviour change, governance. This is the regulatory part of the model, and this is the outcome, which is adoption within 5 years. So what does a model actually tell us? Before I tell you and show you some of the results, it's really important to remember that this is a proof of concept model. It's the first time something like this has really been done in the reef space. The results are from modelled scenarios rather than saying this is reality. When we've worked with stakeholders, they seem to map on what their expectations of reality are, which has been fabulous to see. It's always really nervous when you open up the hood for the first time. And these models are really about providing some guidance and understanding of how tweaking different parts of the system creates relative benefits or constrains potential impact. So it's the overall pattern of findings rather than a, yes, that's a 70% truth there. So then we look at it. First of all, what we've done, recognising that instruments are usually applied in a mix, we've firstly looked at each of the instruments on their own as single instruments. And we've split them into practices that are not regulated, so where there'd be no likelihood of regulations existing for a particular practice, and that's plenty of practices as well. And we've also looked separately at regulated practices, so things that were likely to come under the remit of laws and regulations. So you can see that there's a range of impacts. So what we've got here is, if you look at the top, we've got extension practices, governance and community-based social marketing, and the sort of adoption rate that they can offer, suggested by the model, is about 1/3. So 1/3 of target farmers may adopt the practice under the most favourable circumstances. So what you can see is that these are actually a range, and the upper end of the range is when all the practice and farmer characteristics are set to their most positive, and the lowest end of the range is when they're set to their least favourable. When we combine financial instruments, you get a bit more bang for your buck, so you get adoption rates potentially up to around 55% or something like that, and combining all instruments up to about 65%. When we look at regulated instruments, regulated practices, sorry, this, you do get a little bump up from the role of regulation. So having a practice regulated, even if you don't do a lot else, is what the lawyers call the gorilla in the closet, which is this potential fear of getting in trouble, or the potential to be caught out by rules and regulations. So that provides a little bit of a bump. That was weird. That's the gorilla in the closet, everyone. But we see a similar sort of pattern. So we see extension, governance, community-based social marketing give us these sort of what I would call modest adoption rates of between about 30 to 65%. Adding in financial incentives gives you an extra bang for buck, and regulations do, what we call best practice regulations, do offer an additional benefit and potentially can take us up to about 80%, but when you combine all of these instruments, you can get the biggest effect at all. Importantly, none of them go to 100. There is no real magic behaviour change or practice change model where you can change absolutely every person in the system. So,
Angela?
is that you, Umberto, telling me?
This time is me, yes, it's not the gorilla. Your time is almost over.
That's very sad, but we'll keep going. So the emerging message is that we need to have really realistic expectations about these instruments, and that there's a strong influence, like the balance between the upper and lower is huge. So what's going on there? And we're going to do that really quickly so Umberto doesn't get me in trouble again. So this is a particular scenario with extension and an adoption grant. The upper potential impact is 58% adoption, the bottom is 4%. And if this is when everything is negative except turning on one thing at a time. And that's when everything is positive, except when you make one thing negative at a time. So this tells us, oh, I've got magic, that, for example, if you make implementation costs high in an otherwise perfect scenario, you can drop adoption by quite a significant amount. We can do the same with adoption difficulty is one of the main practice characteristics that influences this, and industry culture, whether the industry overall supports this particular practice. Importantly, if you combine all of the practice characteristics to make them negative, you drag it down. The effect of these is really synergistic. It also tells you it's easier to bring something down than to bring it up. So if a situation is unfavourable, tweaking one element of something isn't going to magically fix stuff, but if things are really favourable, it's easy to lose if certain important things become less favourable. Similarly, with practice characteristics, this is the same scenario, the same type of figure, but with farmer characteristics. So the existing financial resources of the farmer is really important. Oh, can I say 2 more sentences? The mental bandwidth, I think this is really important. This is sort of a concept from psych which recognises our resources to do stuff are not just financial, it's not just a tool or a tractor or money. It's, have we got the space in our brain to think about new stuff? And we know that if we're sick, if you're really stressed, if some other shit's going down, you don't want to know about new stuff. You can't engage with it. And this is really important to recognise that that's an issue here. And so in summary, it's really important to have realistic expectations. These instruments are not magic. Our biophysical colleagues sometimes come to us and go, can't you just sort out the people with some regs and rules and a bit of education? And we have to tell them, and we do, it's not that straightforward. We need to think really in a complex way about social change. Success depends on loads of other stuff. And thinking about fit is really important. The findings about human capital, about financial resources, education, the mental bandwidth, all that stuff that relates to farmer wellbeing raises a really important question. Those issues are not in the typical remit of a reef organisation. So does that mean we need to think about whole of government approaches? So how do we as a reef community think about the broader wellbeing of, say, a farming community or any stakeholder community when we want to take them on the journey to change with us, which is a really important question which maybe has an answer over dinner. So thanks to the research team was huge and amazing, and a lot of them will be online, so if there's a curly question for them, feel free. And also to our funders and advisory team, including especially Billy Gorton from OGBR, thank you.
Thanks so much, Angela. That was perhaps one of the most important talks of the day.
Oh, can I quote you on that in my
It was so interrupted and cut short. And you rushed through some of the conclusions. But I'm thinking I want to give you one more chance to say what was your real take-home message on what would work, because we all grapple with this question of how we're going to change behaviour through so many different tools. Did you see something that really stood out underneath all of that stuff?
That's a whole other glass of wine conversation. I think the thing about mental bandwidth, to go people's resources to think about change in a busy world and a busy and stressful life, is something we don't often talk about enough in behaviour change work. We assume people have this capacity to step out and do a thing. I also think this is a personal opinion and not related to the funders at all, that thinking about other pathways to change, like one of the things that the conservation community talks about a lot is equity, and reef people do as well, but also about community-based conservation, about the role of thinking about the well-being of the people involved as a necessary ingredient for change. And I think from an equity perspective, I think some farming communities would talk about feeling that the weight of action weights a little bit heavily on them at times, and to go, are there actually other things we can do? Are there things in the toolbox? Let's keep doing all the great stuff we're doing with farming communities, like Billy was talking about this morning, but let's not think that that's the only thing we should be doing. We've got a bunch of climate activities, we've got a bunch of working with supply chains to change those. There's a whole range of other bits in the system, and let's not only focus on this one. But I've probably got another 8 points I can share at dinner.
Good. Talk later.
Thank you.